Perfect. Good. Yep.
Oh, all right. So let me just. So hi everybody. I'm Sebern for sure, and I am the author of that said book. Quite the endeavor. Rob asked me to talk a little bit about that, and I'll just talk briefly. About 4 years ago or so, I got a letter from Norton, the publisher Norton, asking me if I would write this book on reactive attachment disorder. By that time, I had become pretty familiar with Bessel's work and reframing the whole idea of reactive attachment disorder and PTSD into a new category, which he would like to have as a new diagnosis, but which was not accepted by the DSM committee, and that was developmental trauma. It becomes pretty clear that you can't diagnose personality disorders officially until somebody is 18. I guess that's because, although contrary to our experience, people don't have personalities until they're 18. But that's the case. So what has become very clear is that developmental trauma is the precursor, at least clear in my mind, is the precursor to personality disorder. So we are talking about developmental trauma in childhood, often in infancy, leading to severe psychological dilemmas that we have. What? Is there a problem? Okay. Which we have...
no, that was just a background.
Okay. Which we have seen as, which we have called in the past personality disorder. So I'm just going to take us through the... let me just try to get rid of this box here. I'm going to... I'm going to just take you through this. Okay. And just to give you an idea of how I think about this and how I think about what treatment we need to use. So the differentiation between attachment disorder and PTSD, that then gets, the differentiation between that and developmental trauma is really in that PTSD can be used as a single incident event that sets off the fear systems in the nervous system. But developmental trauma is really an immersion in systems that only allow the generation of limbic firing. So I'll go through this with you and just describe what developmental trauma, what leads to developmental trauma. And the top of this list is neglect. That shows up in the most diffuse way. This is you could see somebody with developmental trauma with a history just of neglect, with no evidence or history of being injured in any way. Obviously abuse, emotional abuse, harsh discipline, domestic turmoil, assault, sexual, physical, and sadistic. Interestingly, Marty Teicher, when he looks at QEEGs of people with different kinds of developmental impact, negative impact, he will see, for instance, if it's been emotional abuse, he will see that in the auditory cortex. If it's been sexual abuse, it's going to be seen deeper in the brain stem, down in a lot of it actually in the cerebellum. We will talk about that in a little bit. So there's also this primary insecurity, parental absence. There's just a horrendous problem in the United States with incarceration of parents. Food, malnutrition, all of these things. And there's a major impact on the developing brain when there is no nurturing environment, and there's really, in a certain way, no mother. One of the studies that demonstrates this is the ACE study, and for any of you who are not familiar with the ACE study, you really want to become familiar with it, because it outlines the societal impact of the conditions of early neglect and abuse, as well as obviously the impact on the individual. Okay, so one of the most influential writers and theorists on the brain and on developmental trauma and attachment, it was Alan Shore, is still Alan Shore, and his seminal book was Affect Regulation and the Origin of Self, which I'm sure many of you have at least are familiar with. If you haven't, if you made your way all the way through it, you get 5 gold stars. His emphasis throughout all of his work actually is on the development of the right orbital frontal cortex. So we are really talking about the forehead then on the right side, because it is the part of the brain that, to his way of thinking, is the most powerful and important for shutting down the amygdala. There is a almost literal download of the mother's right orbital cortex into the baby's right orbital cortex, and I'll show you a photo of that in a second. The organization of the baby's ROC allows him or her to regulate their emotions. A well-regulated baby doesn't cry excessively. It cries, and as soon as its needs are met, it stops crying. And if you were thinking of this baby and mother in the forest and the predators out searching for food, you would want them not to be signaled in any way by the dysregulation of the baby. And that's still probably the evolutionary necessity, and the reason that the right hemisphere is the first to develop in the human brain. And it's the part of the brain that is devoted to affect and affect regulation or dysregulation, as the case may be. So it's the whole right hemisphere, with, over time, the prefrontal cortex taking over the regulation of the limbic cortex. And when that fails, there's trouble. So emotional regulation is necessary for good executive function and obviously the capacity for relationship. And we see this problem when there's the lack of the development of the prefrontal cortex. We can see that problem. We can see that people have problems in their relationships, including their relationships with the therapist. So this is the Alan Shore sense of no self, and when there's no self, there's no other. Those entities, those subjective and realities never really form. So this is just a picture. This is actually a picture of my daughter with my granddaughter 8 years ago, and you can see, if you look carefully, that that the baby Emily is focusing on her mother's right hemisphere. She's really trying to track how her mother is doing emotionally, and that is an example, I think, of the download that Shore talks about of the mother's right prefrontal cortex to the babies. And this is often done, I mean, this is typically enhanced by the mother holding the baby, and at least initially the mother will hold the baby on her left side giving access to the right prefrontal for the baby and the mother. And also she can be hearing, or he can be hearing, the mother's heartbeat. Interestingly, Shore says, anyway, that men will hold babies either on the right or the left side until they become fathers, and then they also automatically will hold the baby on the left side. You know, some of these are just inbuilt mechanisms. So good enough mothering, Winnicott's term, builds the right orbital cortex, and this is again Shore, because there's more to this story, but this is the part that is fully elaborated by Alan. And this part of our brain inhibits fear and shame and rage, all the primary negative limbic affects that we have to deal with, that our patients have to deal with, those anyway who meet the criteria for personality disorder. Okay, so to the extent that that part of the brain is either developmentally not functioning or has been injured, you will have, the person will have a great deal of difficulty regulating or quieting these limbic impulses, and they're driven by them. We will talk a little bit about the role of the cerebellum, but just to preview that, is that early on in our brain development, it's the cerebellum that quiets these limbic firings. It's not the prefrontal cortex. So you can then imagine how important it is, how the baby is held, how the back of the head is embraced, and what rocking might do. Is rocking, and we will talk a bit more about this, is rocking seems to help set up the sort of density and complexity and functionality of the cerebellum. And interestingly, there are implications too all the way down to the brainstem, which we will also talk about, and whether we are getting to that with top-down neurofeedback training, whatever system we're using. That's an interesting conversation to have. Okay, so with developmental trauma, this is not a one-time thing. This is a child being immersed in a whole system of abuse and neglect, and they are they experience it and they witness it, and their nervous systems form in the absence of a caretaker, or in response to the threat that all too often comes from the caretaker. They have absolutely no sense of safety, and it comes from the universe that is the mother. As one of my colleagues and friends said, you can think of the mother as the domestication of God. So early on, this is the only universe that the baby knows, and the only universe that the baby really needs. And if it's not a regulated universe, and even worse, if it's an assaultive, neglectful universe, there's trouble because the brain can't organize without the other. So what you're left with is many impairments, but one of them is an impaired capacity for cause and effect, which is a right hemisphere logic that, as you can imagine, will create havoc in all learning. If you don't get down cause and effect, which is early on, is I cry and I am held, I am rocked, I am fed, I am changed, or I cry and I'm ignored, or I cry and I am hit, or I am cried and I cry and there's no predictable response. Then this is a person who's not going to be able to learn cause and effect. They just won't have it. And every sense of the word, that impairs them. So the sense of self, this is a drawing that a patient of mine made for me when I asked her early on in our work, very early on in our work, to draw me a sense of how she experienced herself. And it's hard to, she really had no sense of herself other than a kind of fear generator. She only knew herself as someone who was afraid, and we'll get into the implications of that in a little bit. But that's just stunning. Had nothing to do with MIT, by the way. That was just stationery I happened to have handy. Recently, there has been work on or increasing attention to the default mode network. Now, the default mode network is a white matter track, probably multiple white matter tracks that are tracking along primarily along the cingulate in the brain. And I will show you in a second what the default mode network looks like in people without histories of trauma and those with severe trauma. So you can see when you see that slide that the default mode network is not working in those with severe trauma. And if that is the self system, we're really seeing a representation of what Shore talked about as no self. Lanius, in a recent paper, Ruth Lanius, who is the leading fMRI researcher, and her colleague Thomas Ross, who's trained by John Guzelier in neurofeedback, are suggesting that lack of connectivity in the default mode network may be a reliable biomarker for developmental trauma. That would be very interesting since we don't have one yet, and it would also suggest that we need to address that in our training, and that we may address it. We may all be addressing it all the time, but that would be a focus, and to try to zero in on that might be really important, particularly for this population, primarily for this population. So the default mode network also has a role to play in affect regulation. So if it is not well connected and strong, then there's going to be a problem with, it's going to contribute to the problem people have with regulating their emotions. Just as a side note, there was a New Yorker article a few weeks ago on the uptick in psilocybin research. So that's the magic mushroom, and the research in psilocybin, which was shut down in the 70s, is now being allowed for people with cancer, with terminal cancer, who are living in a certain amount of terror about their deaths. And they are given one dose of psilocybin with guides, and what seems to happen for most people is that they will at first have a fear reaction. This is done in a room in a hospital, but a room that looks more like a hotel room, and there's music and so on, and they're comforted through the fear reaction, and then they settle into a kind of expansive sense of themselves, and in that they have a sense that they aren't so important, and that their death is okay, and not in any nihilistic way, but just in the it is as it is kind of way. They seem to, I mean, not exactly the words they use, but the words that I would use about the experience as they describe it to me, as it is described in the New Yorker article, they develop a kind of Buddhist notion of no self. And interestingly, when they look at the brain scans, or the fMRIs of people who have had this psilocybin response, they have a lack of activity in the default mode network. So it's like, you know, I talked about this a little bit in the book, that we go from the default mode network from the sure no self to a sense of self. This is what training is about in my mind for this population. And then for those who hang in there long enough and who can hang in there long enough, you can even go to the you know, to a kind of Buddhist sense of no self. That may be further than any of us end up going, but or a few of us go, but it's possible. Okay, so this is the default mode network in the normal population. You can see the blood flow. So what are the conditions here? So this is, you know, these are the control, 16 normals. And what is happening is that the researcher, the scanner, the person who is scanning, says to the individual in the scanner, I'm going for a cup of coffee or whatever, and you have no task to perform. And what happens, and I'll be back in just a few minutes, and so what happens during that time with people who have had relatively normal childhoods, I always say that with some skepticism. I don't know who these people are, but there apparently are some people. You will see this robust blood flow in the default mode network, and this is the self system seen from the side and from the top. They're thinking about themselves. They're, you know, thinking about you know, what they're going to do for dinner, or how their kids are doing at school, or whatever. But there's a self there to think about. And this next picture is those with severe developmental trauma. So if I could hear any of you, I would hope to hear a terrible sigh, because this is truly the representation of no self that we would see, I think, if we were scanning people with personality disorders, definitely with those with histories of developmental trauma, whether they've been given that diagnosis or not. So my work with neurofeedback, which has now been 17 years, has led me to think about things, and I'm just going to give the sort of a brief outline of this. I write about this extensively in the book. So we think I am using an arousal regulation model, and which was first proposed by the Othmers, and you know, everybody builds on what they've learned. So this is the way that I think about it. So arousal, we can think of arousal as at the brain level. So it's the activation and regulation at the neuronal level, and you know, what's happening, how reactive is this brain to stimulus. Affective, so that's the sort of the physiology of it, and the psychology of it is affective dysregulation. So this felt arousal as it is experienced in the person themselves. So interestingly, again, Marty Teicher is quoted in I think it's Lanius's book on childhood trauma, as saying that in the state of Massachusetts, children who would qualify with developmental trauma 72% of them have positive EEGs for seizure, temporal lobe seizure. So what we may be seeing in the what we might think of as the positive quote unquote symptoms of dissociation, flashbacks, etc., that are suffered by people with trauma may be akin to or seizure-like, or in fact seizure. There's increasing amounts of literature that suggests that people with borderline personality disorder have something akin to temporal lobe seizures, and if you were looking in neurology textbooks, might come across something called temporal lobe personality, and that's very much the same thing. Okay, so then affective dysregulation leads to prevailing states, and the analogy there, the metaphor is weather. So that weather can change, and sometimes very rapid changes are very disorienting for people. They are in weather, and they are in, but they are even more so internally. And these states arise and organize around affective overload. We all make narrative from state, which it's sort of the left hemisphere commenting on the right, and it's in making sense of what we're feeling. You know, that guy almost ran me off the road. I'm justified in, murder, as being one of the possibilities that I've had one patient say. In making sense of that, it also, on a psychological level, cognitive level, reinforces the feeling. It's very hard to get free of a state that you can't question. It grabs you, it holds you. And the more that happens, the more that it becomes a trait. So somebody who's in a lot of, let's say, angry states or shame states or fear states, which are these limbic emotions that I'm talking about, they are, the more that they're in them, the more that will become a trait, the more it will become part or parcel of who they are. And they're all now ego-syntonic. They are felt as who they are, leading to a sense of, this is not linear, but I have to present it in a linear way, personality and identity. And essentially, in this way of looking at things, personality and identity have to do with how much you identify with all of this. The more that you do neurofeedback, the more that you really get to question the statement, this is who I am. Because as you shift arousal at the level of the brain, all of these other things, affect, state, state-dependent narrative, trait, and even personality can shift. Okay, probably should allow questions, but we'll push on here. Okay, so we have the DSM. There are supporters of the DSM. I'm not among them, but this is what we have. And there is in the DSM the notion of an access to disorder. And really what I'm saying here is that an access to disorder is somebody who is affectively very dysregulated and who believes that their feelings are who they are. There's no other experience of self, so there's no other thing to believe. So they will make their decisions based on feeling states, and as we know with borderline personality, or with antisocial personality disorder, there's an instability in relationships, if there's any possibility for relationship at all, and there's a reliance on drugs, either psychotropic drugs, over-the-counter drugs, illegal drugs, or all of the above, for any respite at all from this overwhelming limbic arousal that they have to live in and manage. And it's never or rarely identified as what the problem is for them. So they just end up feeling terrible about themselves, and they're not, generally speaking, good therapy candidates because they don't have a theory of mind. You can't, if you don't have a mind that's organized, that is not just limbically driven, you definitely can't organize a theory of mind. And they don't trust their own minds. If you're having dissociative episodes, derealization, depersonalization, and flashbacks, it's very hard to trust your own mind. There's not a leg to stand on there, but there's no other mind either. You don't exist as the therapist. They don't have an experience of a mother, and so, you know, how does somebody think who is in this broil? I mean, it's just, you know, I hope this gives you empathy. It probably it could also make you feel hopeless, but it's where neurofeedback becomes so critically important. So I think that everyone now would agree that good enough therapy requires the capacity to regulate affect. I think that we offload the most of affect regulation in the therapy of these severely dysregulated people onto the neurofeedback. And that's the gift of neurofeedback. To me, it's the most important gift of neurofeedback for this group, maybe for all of us. And whatever approach to neurofeedback you use, even if you don't use the arousal model, you really want to keep the idea of lowering arousal or easing fear and shame and rage as a goal for your work. I said here early in the process of many survivors, there is very little capacity of insight because there is very little mind. I put survivors in quotation marks, and the reason that I do that is that, in a sense, I'm very ambivalent about using that term. It's really the only one that's available for us, but there's a way in which, without neurofeedback, there are no survivors. They are captured by this repetitive fear circuitry primarily in the brain, and no amount of therapy that I've seen ever really delivers people out of this, no matter what kind of therapy. Teaching people skills is important. Teaching people, you know, people who can manage insight, giving them insight into their dilemmas is very important. But it does not stop the circuitry from firing. In fact, it takes a while for us to get that to happen with neurofeedback often. So in terms of the psychotherapy, very early on, I'm relying on dialectical behavior therapy or skills just to help people manage their symptoms and not asking them to bring insight into the room, and I don't bring that focus into the room either, because there really is, for so many of these people, so little mind to grasp that with. But as we quiet fear, what we see is a developing self. This is exactly what Shore would predict. This is exactly what Dan Siegel writes about. And those who should really be embracing this, I hope they will, if they're not already. And then there is an opportunity to investigate the nature of our minds, and without freak out, really. And one of the things we're looking for in the therapy is that people gain a new sense of, and it will be new, of curiosity about what happened to them, or what, or how they have processed what happened to them. And it will overtake fear or shame or rage as the dominant mode of being. So that shift from limbic-driven experience to curiosity is a major one to look for as you quiet fear, as you quiet all of that. So, although I implied it, I haven't said it so clearly, motherlessness is, I think, the ubiquitous experience of those with histories of developmental trauma. And that comes into the therapy relationship. Whether or not you embrace the notion of transference, these feelings of yearning, unbearable, hopeless yearning for a mother, shame about that because they are grown up now and they shouldn't need a mother, and sometimes that can be very young that people feel that way. Fear of their feeling vulnerable and subject to assault because they have no mother, and rage at their mother and father for not taking care of them, are all hallmarks of developmental trauma. And it's those feelings will impact the relationship with you. There's no way around it. So that's just inevitable. And it'll be to different extents with different people. And in my experience now, 35 years of experience, these feelings can never be adequately met without neurofeedback training. I use the word patient, and I just have to justify that. The reason that I use the word patient instead of client is that it comes from the root of suffering. That word comes from suffering, and these patients are suffering just about as badly as anybody in the world, or creating a lot of suffering in the numbness that is, and that's more true in antisocial personality than it is in borderline personality. This whole Alan Shore sense of no self also begins to subside, and self begins to emerge. But one of the things that you want to be prepared for, if many of you have already seen this and experienced this, is that when people begin to lose fear, fear takes hold again. And I think that's the imperative of the amygdala. Fear is all they have known of themselves, but it's also, it's also the only validation many people have that anything terrible happened to them. But it's also the amygdala itself is, when you begin to take it offline, it reacts, and there's fear. And then you take it offline again, and this happens multiple times. But it seems to be that with each time it gets a little less powerful. And, you know, there's reason to think that Joseph Ledoux feels that once the amygdala is hijacked, it's always hijackable, and I think that, you know, that's largely true and always true if there's no neurofeedback in the picture. Okay, so what do? We're just recognizing the new emerging sense of self, and you just need to know that ahead of time. That's going to happen, ideally or hopefully. You're going to help to quiet that amygdala rebound, and the way that I go about it, as I was saying on the slide, the amygdala is opportunistic. It will look for any opportunity to reassert its warnings should be afraid. And the ways that I manage that are psychoeducation. I show them a model of the brain, or ask them to look at it on the computer and see where in the brain their amygdala is, and when the amygdala starts to fire, to focus on the amygdala in their brain, and to quiet its firing. And this can actually be quite effective for people. Obviously, exercise can be helpful. I have people watch out for caffeine and sugar, because if you raise arousal and you are just in this tentative period of quieting the amygdala, it will find that as an opportunity to fire too. Spiritual practice, support groups, and obviously your therapeutic relationship are all vital in this period of time. So there's a new self. You want to notice it, align with it, and nurture it. I slowly reduce reliance on neurofeedback, because people can get confused, believing that they need the neurofeedback to stay regulated, because they've been so dysregulated without it. And what I have found is that if fear is too great, neurofeedback can be ineffective or counterproductive, at least to begin with. Because you are doing something to their brain, and if they don't feel good as a result of what you have done, they are going to feel you're doing something to them. And so this is a limitation to the use of neurofeedback with certain patients that fall in this category. And I don't have a magic answer to this. I just work with people in the therapy relationship, and we'll test this out and then work with their responses. And I always, of course, hope that I don't make them feel better or worse. I hope that I make them feel better, but that doesn't always happen. So I'm just going to quickly go over protocols so we can leave some time for questions. In the arousal model, these are the protocols: T4 minus P4, P4, C4, C4 minus P4. F4, F8, and FPO2 are the ones that I probably use the most. T4, P4 the most, FPO2 often, but I don't use FPO2 until I have a good sense of how the brain is. That seems to directly communicate with the amygdala, and the amygdala is the most prone, the part of the brain most prone to kindling or to seizure, so you want to be careful with that. The frequency is to be determined. It's not there is no frequency there's no protocol really for developmental trauma. Anything that works for this brain to quiet fear is what you're going for. We had time about the possibility of overlapping reward and inhibit. All I'll say right now is that there's not a problem if they do overlap. The brain does sort that out. And we are using the reward in the way that I'm thinking about this really to leverage the brain's arousal and obviously the affect that the person is experiencing. And often, it can take some pretty low frequency to do that with these very charged nervous systems, limbically charged nervous systems. I'm using the inhibit primarily to enhance the stability of the brain, because seizures, and we know these are seizure-prone or event-prone brains, those will develop in slow wave. So I keep a fairly tight inhibit on 1 to 6 hertz, generally speaking, to protect the brain against its own proclivity toward dysregulating in those frequencies. There is, as I mentioned before, there is research on the cerebellum, and I'll just quickly say what this is. Heath was working in the I think it's Louisiana Primate Center. It's got a better name than that, but that's what I remember right now. And he was looking at these orphan monkeys that Harlow was writing about. And he saw a difference when he rocked the monkeys who were just given a cloth mother as opposed to keeping that mother stationary. And what he was doing was increasing the functionality of the cerebellum. I was informed that the cerebellum was not trainable with neurofeedback, and because there's no frequency in the cerebellum. This is still somewhat mysterious, but Carl Anderson, who's one of the leading experts in the world on the cerebellum, has become intrigued with neurofeedback and found some Russian literature in which asserts that the cerebellum is in fact firing at a very high frequency, I think something like 250, something like that, hertz. But I think it may very well be possible to help the cerebellum along, and since that is particularly an issue seems to be an issue in, obviously, in early regulation of the limbic system, and also in sexual abuse, we want to see if we can. The front of the brain connects to the brainstem, and so messages from the front of the brain go to the brainstem, and from the brainstem sends its messages through the cerebellum, and the cerebellum projects forward to the front of the brain. So the cerebellum is very important. It's got to be connected to the rest of the brain electrically, or rhythmically, because that's how the brain works. And a woman named Jacqueline Gisborne has developed a protocol called Beta Reset, which may target the cerebellum. The default mode network, we said, that lack of connectivity in the default mode network is the biomarker, may very well be the biomarker for early developmental trauma. And David Kaiser, many of you know, is now developing protocols based on brain maps to address connectivity. And he agrees with Lannis on the ubiquity of this problem. He does two-channel co-modulation training at FPZ and PZ. So then there's the brainstem. Damasio talks about the brainstem giving rise to the proto-self, so the self before the self. And he says that every affective experience seems to have some particular space in the brainstem, some particular nuclei in the brainstem, and where it's held, every affective experience that we have, and it's held sort of in separate spaces. Bruce Perry, who's a trauma researcher and clinician, suggests that ancestral memory is stored in the brainstem. So there's this upflow of fear experiences from the brainstem and the hypothalamus, which we may not be reaching with top-down neurofeedback, which is what most of us are doing. And I have started to explore the use of STIM approaches. The one that I have found to be the most effective is called Nexilin, and I can talk about that if you're interested in that. I can talk a little bit more about that. I'm still pretty new to it, but what I'm seeing is it's encouraging. Okay, so that's my book, Neurofeedback in the Treatment of Developmental Trauma, where now I have spoken to you for about 50 minutes. This is 300 pages, so if you're interested, you can see some elaboration on what I've said. And thank you.
All right. Well, we have a few minutes left for those that may have some questions of Sebern.
I'm just unmuting everybody so that
okay.
they can all. A lot of people came in late, and we didn't get a chance to get them all unmuted. So it'll take me a minute. There's a lot of them here.
Okay.
Okay.
Jay Gaddis.
Hey, Jay, we can hear you. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you for the presentation. It was fantastic. I look forward to reading your book, Sebern.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I know on our list, on our discussions, a lot of the same authors and concepts have emerged and been circulated. So I think this group is very on board with a lot of your presentation, and it makes a lot of sense to them.
Oh, good, good. I hope it wasn't repetitive to all of you then.
Not at all. No, there's a lot of
No.
particularly the way you put it together. Fascinating.
Well, thank you.
Is there more in your book about the cerebellum training? Because I'm really interested.
Yeah, there is some, but not a lot. I think that if you look for Jacqueline Gisborne, I think you could find her at Eager, at the Eager site, www.eager.com. She may be also, it may be betareset@gmail.com. I'm not positive about that, but she's it's not just the cerebellum she's interested in. It's taking the back of the brain into gamma, and she has a whole rationale for that, and it's pretty interesting. It's actually very interesting what she's doing, how she's thinking about it. But that's another, maybe that's another invite for her to come and talk about it, because she's put stuff together in very interesting ways.
Another thing I like, Sebern, is that you're using basic standard neurofeedback of various kinds in your approach to this, and not just seeking solutions in the ultra technological high-end features that are being promoted by a lot of the manufacturers.
Right, Richard, you and I agree about this.
Yeah. Well, we have the same track. We've learned a lot from the same people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I don't feel we're old-fashioned yet,
no.
right?
Well, that's how they're trying to present it. Well, if you're not, we have barely touched the surface. I think of exploring these 1- and 2-channel protocols and how they relate. And already they're building rocket ships to the next galaxy. It's like, well, wait.
Yeah, right, right.
Sebern, I have a question. Hi, it's Victor McGregor.
Hi, Vic.
Hi. It's really helpful to hear you to remind us to combine neurofeedback with the verbal therapy, because invariably our jobs lead us to emphasize one or the other, but this combination is really important and fascinating to continue to evolve our theory of the mind. And I was wondering, quite often I see people both generally in society who talk about the importance of following your feeling and being assertive, developing those ego states. But how do you go on to elaborate and this question of the theory of the mind is so big, right? Yes. Even if the brain, and when the brain is operating optimally, where do we go with the theory of the mind about teaching children limits and trying to do it in such a way that they don't get over-aroused?
Well, I think that, I don't know how to put all of that together, but I think that, it's fairly clear most of our brain is devoted to inhibition. And that behavioral systems really ought to mimic what the brain is doing, that there has to be at least a certain amount of constraint on a nervous system. And one of the problems with developmental trauma, one of the reasons that we see developmental trauma, is that there has not been that constraint on the nervous system. Abuse is not constraint. Neglect is clearly not constraint. So there's nothing really, in a certain way, metaphorically anyway, for the nervous system to push back against to get information about how to organize and organize itself. So, a full discussion of ego states and how the brain gives rise to them and the default mode network and all is to make much longer than we have. But I think that in terms of child raising anyway, and of helping people avoid the terrible onslaught that is the sequelae to developmental trauma, we need to understand the importance of the interaction with the parent and the child, the regulation of the parent to regulate the child, and that is by its very nature a constraint on both the behavior and the nervous system of the baby. in the young child. I hope that answers that.
Right. That certainly helps. I mean, I know we don't have very much time, but because I'm raising an adolescent, I know there are points at which the parent, I rationalize in my brain that when the adolescent is pushing the limit, there's got to be some way that as a parent I'm allowed to not always be totally regulated in order to teach the child that my theory of mind means that there are some limits, and if in the old days they would do corporal punishment. Now we obviously don't do that, and we don't want to get over emotional, but as the tools that are left for just normal development are increasingly slim to teach healthy limits to adolescents today when they're living on their social media.
Well, yes, that's it. That I'm sure you are not alone in dealing with those issues, Vic.
Right. Well, thank you for your input. It's been very helpful. Appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Sebern. This is Kathleen Friend.
Well, hello. How are you?
I'm good. I thank you so much for this presentation. Every time I listen to you, I just, I get it at different layers. And I really picked up this time about that amygdala kickback. And you can be going along, and then it just kicks back. And that was a fantastic reminder of how to put that in a context for the person you're treating so that they also don't get discouraged. And the other thing, just really quickly, Victor, my favorite parenting, we don't have time to go into it, but you can look it up yourself. It's called the Nurtured Heart Approach. I think it's fantastic. I think it doesn't inflict, I think it helps build inner strength, emotional wealth without these other issues, and it can work for teenagers too. Thank you.
You know what, Kathy, I also think that it's helpful for clinicians to not to get discouraged too, when you recognize that the amygdala is really trying to do what it's devoted to, which is to protect. And so every time you take it offline, if I can be criticized for anthropomorphizing the brain, but I don't know anything else to do with it. The amygdala has a mind of its own, and its presence seems to be required. So so anytime you take it offline, it is threatened, and it comes back, and then but slowly but surely that resolves. For most people.
Great. Keep the clinicians.
Dr. Fischer, Martin Gremlich. Sorry, Kathleen. Martin Gremlich here, Dr. Fischer. Would you say the basic approach or the most important thing is just a global calming down of the central nervous system as a basis for a successful treatment?
In this population?
In this population.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's that, and as I've sort of sped through this because of the time, but yeah, and how to do that is is what we're all looking at.
Well, that would explain a lot, a lot of effects we see with alpha-theta training, the conventional one, maximum two positions.
You mean eyes closed alpha theta?
Yeah, eyes closed alpha theta over a longer period of time, like half an hour, and it would explain much of the effects some people have, like flashbacks or abreactions and stuff. It does explain, and it's actually demonstrating how healthy they could be if they don't exaggerate. Healthy, I mean those abreactions, they must go through it in order to take the amygdala offline. Is that right?
Well, just so you sometimes, as required by the person, I have seen some incredibly positive effects with alpha theta training, but I don't think it has to do with abreaction. I think the trauma theory increasingly suggests, and trauma treatment theory, that abreaction is something to avoid, and I try very hard to avoid it. I think that in the early alpha theta training theory, treatment and theory, that they always did stabilizing training of some sort. It was either hand warming or SMR training before they began alpha theta, and the idea there was to quiet the physiological response, because abreaction works the fear circuitry. So it's something that you actually would like to avoid, since it is the repetitive firing of this fear circuitry that is causing all the trouble to begin with. So, sometimes it can't be avoided, because it is such an area of the brain sensitive to or prone to kindling and prone to excitability, but it's not something to go after. So
I totally agree to that. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, I totally agree to that. It's, but abreactions have a definition, but we do abreact maybe in a non-conscious level, less severely that we could actually be aware of it. But when we do alpha theta training, there is a mini abreaction to actually disconnect the amygdala patterns. Even so, it's not noticed, it's the process which I call abreaction.
Well,
to a
okay.
degree
Okay, what I would recommend is that you find your own term and get it out there, because abreaction has got this connotation inbuilt into it, and
Yeah.
it would be a re-upping of the amygdala, not a disconnection of the amygdala.
Okay.
Although, we could talk about that, and I can surely see your point.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful.
All right. Well, Sebern, I think we're going to wrap it up, because we're gone over the hour, and many of us have people to see. But thank you again so much for your time and willingness to come to our Lunch and Learn webinars and be a guest speaker. And,
my pleasure.
Wish you well, and
Thank
thanks
you.
so much for your new book, and everybody else, I guess we'll
Get
see
the
you
word-
on.
Get the word out,
ahead.
guys. Get the word out.
Oh, we will. Oh, we will.
I'm sure we have been.
Absolutely.
Okay, very good. Thanks a lot, everybody. Be well.
You
Bye.
too. Bye.
Thank you.